So here we are at the beginning of part 2 of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on trial. We left off part 1 where Adam and Eve had been chased out of the Garden of Eden by a very irritated God who didn't want them to gain any knowledge, and not any knowledge of good and evil, which they did by typical human curiosity and desire for knowledge. So contrary to God's orders, they ate the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and God kicked them out of the Garden of Eden. So the rest of the Bible takes place outside of the Garden of Eden, and we pick up in Genesis 4, where we have the story of Cain and Abel, the two sons of Adam and Eve. And they are, of course, outside of the Garden of Eden. Now, of course, instead of me reading the script of the play and eventually the movie, just pretend that when I'm reading The Judge, it's actually going to be Al Pacino. When I'm reading the Israeli defendant attorney, that it's Dustin Hoffman. And when it's the Palestinian defender, instead of me reading it, it's Timothée Chalamet acting the part. That will certainly be much more interesting and dramatic. And so if you ask, well, am I really going to get them? Who knows? Maybe, maybe not. We'll see. In any case, so we continue with the prosecution. And he says, now let's go on to Genesis 4, where it is written that outside of the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve had two children, Cain and Abel. They each decided to make an offering to God. Cain cultivated wheat, so he brought the Lord a sheaf of his best wheat. Abel tended a flock of goats and offered God a plate of roasted goat meat. God had regard for the roasted meat offering, but he had no regard for the sheaf of wheat, leading to Cain's deep disappointment and jealousy. Cain was so disturbed by God's unequal treatment and so jealous of Abel that he ended up murdering his brother. God was incensed, telling him in Genesis 4:11-12, now you are accursed. You will be a fugitive and a wanderer on earth. Cain replied 4:14, today you have driven me away, and I shall be hidden from your face. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on earth, and anyone who meets me may kill me. God replied in Genesis 4:15-16, not so. Whoever kills Cain will suffer a sevenfold vengeance. And the Lord put a mark on Cain so that no one who came upon him would kill him. Then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. The Old Testament continues in Genesis 4:17. Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. So again, we have a lot to unpack. First of all, what do each of you two defenders think of God's dismissive treatment of Cain, who offered him the best he was capable of, in contrast to God's express pleasure with Abel's offering of meat, roasted goat meat? Was that the way a good father treats his children, openly favoring one over the other, arbitrarily and without empathy? Israeli defender, what do you think? Israeli defender, I cannot question God's words or behavior. He knows best. Palestinian defender, I agree. Cain had to learn what pleases God and do better the next time. The prosecution, but Cain did his best. He only knew how to till the land and grow wheat. He could not offer a plate of meat or anything else. Is that how you would treat your own children? If so, you're going to have mentally disturbed children. That often leads to violence towards others, even suicide. You don't understand that? In fact, God was guilty of bad parenting with regard to Cain. Parents are responsible for their children being profoundly unhappy, depressed, and mentally disturbed, since that is due to bad parenting, which is what much of the world is afflicted by. Okay, defenders, you're not on trial. The conflict is, along with the Old Testament and the Quran, which both incite the conflict. So let's get back to the Bible and its degree of veracity. Two questions beg to be answered. Why was Cain afraid of encountering other people who might kill him? And how could Cain find a wife? In fact, there were only 4 people on earth at the time of Cain: Cain and his brother Abel and their parents Adam and Eve. So why did Cain fear crossing paths with other people? And why did God put a mark on his forehead in order to assure no stranger would kill him? And how and from where did Cain's wife materialize? Another question arises here, as before. Who is the narrator? And why did the narrator transcribe what he witnessed, and for whom did he transcribe it? All of this does not compute. Palestinian defender, what do you think? Is the veracity of the Old Testament to be doubted? Palestinian defender, not doubtful at all. The Old Testament simply skips over how and when God created other humans. Israeli defender, exactly. The prosecution, why would such important details be omitted from the Old Testament? That doesn't seem logical to me. Many would think such an omission is a sign that the Old Testament is a tall tale. In any case, let's proceed and take up the case of Noah and his ark. In Genesis 6.5-8, it is written, "The Lord saw that the wickedness of humankind was great in the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he had made humankind on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out from the earth the human beings I've created, people together with animals and creeping things and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the sight of the Lord. Then God told Noah, whom he found to be righteous, to make an ark and fill it with his family and all species of animals of both sexes, in order to survive the great rains of 40 days and 40 nights, the biblical flood, which killed all humans and animals Noah left behind. By the way, Noah was 600 years old when the flood waters came on earth, according to Genesis 7.6. Noah seems to have been exempted from the lifespan reduction to 120 years, or else the narrator was mistaken. A few questions arise. There is no mention of dinosaurs in Genesis. Yet we know dinosaurs existed in the Mesozoic era, consisting of the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous periods, about 250 to 60 million years ago. Whereas according to the Bible, the earth and Adam and Eve were created around 6,000 years ago, as per the number of human generations listed in the Bible up to the birth of Jesus. We also know that due entirely to natural planetary forces, not to burning fossil fuels, we have had 5 major ice ages, each followed by 5 major global warmings. The first ice age occurring about 2.5 billion years ago. The last one ending about 11,500 years ago. Science has determined through DNA evidence that Homo sapiens first appeared about 300,000 years ago in Africa. These science numbers flatly contradict the timeline of the Old Testament by huge amounts, undermining the veracity of the Bible. How do the defenders respond? The Israeli defendant. The science must be mistaken. The evidence it has produced is not convincing. As for dinosaurs, all fossils of dinosaurs were found outside the Middle East, meaning there were no dinosaurs in the land where Noah built his ark. In any case, the dating of the fossils and of the ice ages is not credible. The Palestinian defendant. Very simply, there must be fallacies in the scientific determinations. The Bible is the truth. The prosecution. By the way, and here I digress, it is important to point out that the theory that burning fossil fuels by humans causes global warming is flatly contradicted by the fact that the most recent global warming cycle began around 11,700 years ago at the end of the last ice age. Thousands of years before humans started burning fossil fuels. That warming cycle is still ongoing today. We are in the middle of the latest global warming cycle. The current warming cycle will probably continue for hundreds or thousands of more years. It is also important to point out the corollary of the theory that burning fossil fuels is the cause of the current global warming. The corollary would be that by burning fossil fuels, humans can avert the next ice age. That's quite absurd. That is the problem which must be addressed. Meanwhile, banning fossil fuels tomorrow worldwide would not stop global warming. There should be no illusions about that. Natural planetary forces are the determining factor. The judge. Once again, prosecution, please refrain from your digressions, however interesting they may be at times. The prosecutions. My apologies, Your Honor. To return to God's causing the 40-day and 40-night flood due to his being enraged by humans' wickedness, it is reasonable to ask why God created humans capable of being wicked. Since God created humans in his own image, does that mean God himself has wicked traits? And why would God have subjected innocent animals and humans to the devastating flood? Israeli and Palestinian defenders, answer the question. Does God have a wicked streak? Israeli defendant. Yes, he said so himself. He is irascible, he is vengeful. He even instituted the concept of generational guilt. Palestinian defendant. It's clear that he does have a wicked streak, since he made humans in his image. Very simply. The prosecution. Well then, it would logically follow that God is ultimately responsible for all bad human behavior. He could have programmed humans without wickedness in their heart and blood. As for generational guilt, that of course is in violation of human rights. So who is more moral, God or modern humans with their Universal Declaration of Human Rights? The Israeli defendant. That's the wrong way of putting it. God made humans capable of making advances in morality. The Palestinian defendant. Yes, it's all thanks to God, Allah. The prosecution. Okay, let's now turn to the story of Abraham. Why did God pick Abraham in particular for his favors in Genesis 12? What was so special about Abraham, who even gave his wife Sarai to the Egyptian Pharaoh, telling him she was his sister in order to be in Pharaoh's good graces? By the way, Pharaoh was a real gentleman. When he found out that Abraham and his wife had lied to him, he simply told them to leave Egypt with all their belongings, including the many gifts of jewelry and animals that he had given them. He did not dispossess them or have them jailed or killed. In any case, Abraham was already in his 80s, and so was his wife. How could she have been found so attractive by Pharaoh that he ended up marrying her? That's not credible. Much less credible is Genesis 17.1-8, where God makes the big covenant with Abraham. Quote, when Abraham, actually he was called Abram initially by God. When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless. And I will make my covenant between me and you, and will make you exceedingly numerous. Then Abram fell on his face, and God said to him, as for me, this is my covenant with you. You shall be the ancestor of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be Abram, but your name shall be Abraham. For I have made you the ancestor of a multitude of nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of you, and kings shall come from you. I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your offspring after you. And I will give you and to your offspring after you the land where you are now an alien, all the land of Canaan for a perpetual holding, and I will be their God. Genesis 17.9-14 continues. God said to Abraham, As for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your offspring after you throughout their generations. This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and your offspring after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. You shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskins, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you. Throughout your generations, every male among you shall be circumcised when he is 8 days old, including the slave born in your house and the one bought with your money from any foreigner who is not of your offspring. Both the slave born in your house and the one bought with your money must be circumcised. So shall my covenant be in your flesh, an everlasting covenant. Any uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. Okay, that's end quote. Where shall we begin? Israeli and Palestinian defenders. How do you explain that God singled out Abraham for his covenants? Why was Abraham so deserving? Why him? Why not somebody else? After all, he gave his wife to Pharaoh, lying that she was his sister. That's not honorable. The Israeli defender. God must have had his reasons. We trust in God. The Palestinian defender. I agree. It is not for humans to question God's choices. The prosecution. Well, what about Sarah, the old woman in her 80s? How could she have been found so attractive by Pharaoh that he married her? The Israeli defender. That's not for us to question. The Bible says it happened. The Palestinian defender. Some women remain beautiful beyond their youth. Sarah could have looked much younger than her age, and she was still beautiful. That's credible. The prosecution. All right. But how? Why did God require Abraham and all his male descendants to be circumcised in order to confirm the covenant? Where did God come up with that wild idea? Adam wasn't circumcised. God made Adam with a foreskin for a reason. After all, it clearly offers protection and other benefits. So why, after 2,000 years, did God decide circumcision was an appropriate act to confirm the covenant with Abraham? Couldn't slicing off a small part of an earlobe be a more appropriate act to confirm the covenant? The earlobe doesn't have any function after all, and a sliced earlobe would be visible to all, an important detail, no? Well, circumcision is not visible to all, except in nudist colonies and beaches. What was God's logic? Palestinian defender, do you have an answer? Have you ever asked yourself why God decided circumcised penises should be the sign of confirming the covenant? You should, since Muslims are circumcised just like Jews, claiming to be descendants of Abraham. The Palestinian defender. No, I've never worried about that. As I've said, I don't question God's decisions. He must have his reasons. The prosecution. Well, can you explain why many Muslims have their girls circumcised? Why many Muslim girls undergo genital cutting, their clitoris is sliced off, when God clearly said he only expects males to be circumcised? The Palestinian defender. Well, it's just treating girls like boys are treated, to be fair. No discrimination. If God wants boys to be circumcised, he probably also wants girls circumcised, even if he omitted to say that. The prosecution. But there's no comparison. Cutting off a clitoris is much worse than cutting off a foreskin. It can lead to severe infection, even chronic infections, and it greatly reduces a woman's sexual pleasure. The Palestinian defender. It is best that women do not have too much sexual pleasure, otherwise they might stray. The prosecution. Well, men stray. If that's okay, why insist that only women must not stray? That's primitive patriarchal discrimination, a violation of human rights. You probably have not carefully read the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Probably you never read it at all before this trial. Have you read the Universal Declaration? The Palestinian defender. No, I have not. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights does not count compared to the Bible and the Quran. The prosecution. Well, the declaration should count. In fact, all members of the United Nations have undersigned it, committing themselves to respect and enforce it. When there will be a Palestinian state, if it wants to join the United Nations, it will have to sign the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and uphold it. The Palestinian state will have to teach it to all its citizens and uphold it. Do you realize that? The Palestinian defender. That will be decided by the leaders of the Palestinian state. I have no other comment. The prosecutor. Palestinian defender, do you realize that it is much better for men when women can have sexual pleasure? You probably don't, since you've probably not been with an uncircumcised woman. It's like, how can a man really enjoy being with a woman who's not attracted to him? She will be cold. A man is much more excited and gets much more sexual pleasure when the woman he's with desires him intensely. Your practice of female genital cutting is bad for women and it is bad for men. Plus, nowhere is it written in the Bible or the Quran that girls should be circumcised. How do you justify that primitive, unjust, and immoral practice? The Palestinian defender. The practice is not written in the Bible or the Quran, but it has been validated for centuries in Muslim society and understood to be the will of Allah. And, as I said, it keeps women from straying from their husbands. It is much less important when a man strays from his wife. In fact, men are allowed by the Old Testament and the Quran to have many wives, but women are not allowed to have more than one husband. The prosecution. It is true that the Old Testament allows men to have more than one wife, but in modern times, that is not generally allowed. Only Islamic nations allow polygamy, discriminating against women. By the way, in Genesis 38:15, the story of Judah and Tamar, it is written that Tamar covered her face with a veil in order not to be recognized by Judah. And when Judah saw her, he assumed she was a prostitute precisely because she was covered. In other words, only prostitutes were covered in biblical times, not honorable women. So please tell us, why in Islamic society are all women covered? Why do you consider covered women honorable and unveiled women prostitutes? In the Bible, it's the opposite. The Palestinian defender. That is our culture. That is our belief. The prosecution. So you think that all women in non-Islamic countries are prostitutes since they are not veiled? The Palestinian defender. Not all, but many are. Or at least they're not serious, not pure. The prosecution. Okay, let's drop that and move on. Let's go back to Abraham. In Genesis 17:15, it is written, God said to Abraham, quote, as for Sarai, your wife, you shall not call her Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. How to explain God's interest in changing Abram's name to Abraham and Sarai's name to Sarah? Israeli defender, what is the reason for such extreme micromanaging by God? The Israeli defender, I don't know. God must have had some reason. It's not up to humans to question his choices. I have faith in God and his decisions. I do not question them. I believe in the Old Testament and in the covenant between God and Abraham and all Jews. The covenant is the reason Jews claim all the land of Israel. The prosecution. In Genesis 25:7-10, it is written, this is the length of Abraham's life, 175 years. Abraham breathed his last and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people. his sons Isaac and Ishmael, buried him in the cave of Machpelah, in the field of Ephron, son of Zohar the Hittite, east of Mamre, the field that Abraham purchased from the Hittites. There Abraham was buried with his wife Sarah." End quote. Regarding Sarah's death and burial, in Genesis 23.1-2, it is written, quote, "Sarah lived 127 years. That was the length of Sarah's life. And Sarah died at Kiryat Arba," that is currently Hebron, the city of Hebron, "in the land of Canaan. And Abraham went in to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her." Two things to note here. Somehow Abraham lived longer than the 125 years God had decided earlier. What would be the limit for human beings? In any case, the important detail is where Abraham and Sarah were buried, in the city of Hebron in the West Bank, which is why Israelis make regular pilgrimages there, and why Israeli settlers have acquired homes there, even though the majority of the population is Palestinian. The detail is important because Muslims claim Abraham is buried in Mecca's Kaaba. Is that not correct, Palestinian defender? The Palestinian defender. Not all Muslims. Some agree that Ibrahim, as we call Abraham, is buried in Hebron. But they believe Ibrahim was involved with creating the Kaaba in Mecca for pilgrimage, and others believe he was buried there in Mecca. The prosecution. Well, you said you believed in the Bible, so I imagine you believe Abraham is buried in Hebron, not in Mecca. Furthermore, the trek from Hebron to Mecca is a very long one across deserts. How likely is it that Abraham would ever have gone to Mecca, especially over 2,500 years before Muhammad was born and founded Islam? For what reason would he have gone to Mecca? There was no reason for Abraham to go to Mecca. Now, regarding Ishmael, he was Abraham's child with his Egyptian slave Hagar, according to Genesis 16 and 21. In Genesis 21.14, it is written that Abraham sent Hagar and Ishmael away to no longer live with him and Sarah. The reason Abraham sent Hagar and Ishmael away was either because Sarah complained she was offended by Hagar, that's Genesis 16.4-6, or because Sarah didn't want Ishmael to inherit along with Isaac, her son with Abraham, Genesis 21.9-11. In any case, in Genesis 21.20-21, it is written about Ishmael that after he left Abraham, quote, "God was with the boy, and he grew up. He lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother got a wife for him from the land of Egypt." End quote. It must be noted, therefore, that there is no record in the Bible of Abraham or Ishmael ever going to Mecca. Yet Muslims and the Quran revere Abraham and Ishmael as the founders of Islam, whereas Muhammad is viewed as the prophet of Islam and the last prophet of the God of the Bible. As is well known, Islam considers Muhammad, not Jesus, as the final prophet of the God of the Bible. Islam, furthermore, denies that Jesus is the Son of God. Is that correct, Palestinian defender? Palestinian defender. That is correct. The prosecution. Please explain how Abraham can be considered the founder of Islam when he was Jewish. The Palestinian defender. Ibrahim, or Abraham as you call him, is considered the founder of Islam because, very simply, Islam derives from the Bible. Muhammad follows the prophets Abraham, Moses, and Jesus. Again, Jesus is not considered the Son of God, Allah, the way God is called by Muslims. Jesus is considered by Muslims only a prophet, with Muhammad being the last and final prophet, and therefore the most important prophet. The prosecution. All right. Now let's examine Moses' laws. starting with the Ten Commandments. Israeli Defender, would you please start reading the book of Exodus, point 20. Israeli Defender. Exodus 20 starts as follows. Then God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on the earth below, or that is in the water, or under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord, am your God. I am a jealous God, punishing children for the iniquity of parents, to the third and the fourth generation of those who reject me, but showing steadfast love to the 1,000th generation of those who love me and keep my commandments. The prosecution. I will interrupt for some comments. Here God says something quite astonishing. He introduces the concept of generational guilt, which is completely contrary to modern morality. Down to 4 generations, not just 1 or 2, 4 generations of children punished by God simply because their great-great-grandparents rejected God or disobeyed God? Israeli Defender, do you justify or approve of God in this instance? The Israeli Defender. Humans cannot question God's decisions. He had his reasons, which must have been valid. However, that does not mean modern humans need to embrace the concept of generational guilt. In fact, Israeli law does not foresee generational guilt. The Palestinian Defender. We agree that God cannot be questioned for imposing generational guilt, although the possibility of generational guilt might be acceptable even today, when limited to the direct offspring of the guilty. Numerous nations of different religions do so. Even atheist nations do so. The prosecution. It must be noted by everyone that any degree of generational guilt, even limited to the direct offspring of the guilty, is only implemented by dictatorial regimes, which intentionally, regularly, and systematically violate numerous categories of human rights. Democratic nations entirely reject generational guilt, with no exceptions. In any case, God openly stating that he is jealous and vindictive is disturbing, is it not? Being jealous and vindictive is not considered an admirable trait in modern democratic societies. Nevertheless, many humans are jealous and vindictive, and many embrace the concept of generational guilt. That should not be a surprise, since God created humans in his image. On the important matter of dictatorships being the worst violators of human rights, whether on the left or on the right, these dictators, the explanation for their propensity lies in the psychological makeup of their leaders. The judge. Prosecution, stop with your digressions. The prosecution. Your Honor, please indulge me here. This topic is of great importance. The judge. You are straining my patience. The prosecution. Thank you, Your Honor, but I'll just be brief, please. Without exception, dictators and their collaborators all have severe psychological problems due to not having been properly or sufficiently loved by their parents. That results in an acute inferiority complex, along with intense anger and a lack of empathy. They need to feel in complete control, and they want to inflict pain as revenge for having suffered growing up. That's why they are dictators. Not having been loved by their parents, they don't feel they can be loved, only feared. That explains Hitler, Stalin, and all other dictators, current and past. There can never be a good dictator. They are always monsters. The supporting evidence is history. There has never been a dictator who was not cruel, unempathetic, dishonest, demagogic, mentally disturbed, and violent with his own people, not only with those of other nations. Dictators often rationalize that they are dictators for the good of their citizens and the glory of their nation. But the truth is, they only care for themselves. Their desire for national glory is rooted in the desire for personal glory, which would accompany it. That's why dictators often start wars, why they want to conquer other nations, using all sorts of false pretexts to justify their wars. Some dictators try to cloak their aggressions with historical, religious, or ideological justifications, for the consumption of others, of course, but at times even to justify to themselves their own aggressions, realizing deep down that they are immoral, but not wanting to openly acknowledge it to themselves. Like all criminals, they are not truly responsible for their cruelties, their dishonesty, their violations of human rights and of international law. Those violations are the result of their upbringing. The responsibility for their crimes lies actually with their parents. Humans' free will is often limited when there is bad parenting. Bad parenting is one of the scourges of humanity. The only solution is to prevent bad parenting on Earth, and that requires having 4-year psychology courses in every high school, accompanied by group therapy and good parenting workshops. It's absurd that no high school anywhere in the world has such courses. Just like it is absurd that there are no courses on the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the world history of human rights violations. That's why human rights violations never end, because of the ignorance of so many of the world's citizens. The judge: excuse me, prosecution, please refrain from any more digressions and your personal opinions on matters having nothing to do with this trial. The prosecution: Your Honor and members of the jury, this seeming digression is actually relevant to the unending Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Leaders on both sides lack empathy and a proper knowledge of human rights and the history of human rights violations, from antiquity to the present. The same goes for a large number of their citizens. They all ignore that religious discrimination is a violation of human rights, and they all ignore that all member nations of the United Nations have undersigned the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and have thereby pledged to respect and uphold it. And they have not even read the Universal Declaration. That's why the conflict has lasted for so long, with no end in sight. The State of Palestine is not yet a member nation, but the United Nations has recognized Palestine as a non-member UN observer state under the direction of the Palestinian National Authority. Consequently, the Palestinian Authority implicitly acknowledges and pledges to respect the UN's Charter and its Universal Declaration, while violating both of them. Well-educated, psychologically well-adjusted citizens, properly loved by their parents, would always be against violence and seek equitable solutions. Their goal would be to ensure fairness and friendship. Well-meaning, well-educated, intelligent leaders on both sides of the conflict would understand the imperative of having well-educated and psychologically well-adjusted citizens in order for the conflict to end. That requires a major reform of their high school curriculums. Two crucially important courses are precisely the 4-year high school courses I just mentioned a few moments ago, that is psychology accompanied by group therapy and good parenting workshops, and 2, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights accompanied by the world history of human rights violations. Unfortunately, neither side of the conflict is even considering such essential high school curriculum reform. But they should. They should implement such reform immediately. Had they implemented such reform decades ago, the conflict would have been over decades ago. Having made those points, which apply to all humanity, to all nations, not just the Israelis and Palestinians, I return to the last of the 10 commandments in Exodus 20:17, where it is written, quote, "You shall not covet your neighbor's house, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or male or female slave, or ox or donkey or anything that belongs to your neighbor. The main point here is that slavery is an institution which God approves of, to the point of including it in one of the 10 Commandments. Of course, we have already seen that God approved of Abraham having a female slave, Hagar, with whom he had his first son. Slavery, of course, a violation of human rights, is prohibited by the Universal Declaration. Slavery is also referred to in the Quran, Surah 24.31-33, where it is written, quote, "The women must wear head coverings except in the presence of their husbands or fathers or their sons or brothers or their female slaves or male eunuch slaves, your male slaves and your female slaves, and do not compel your slave girls to prostitution." So, I asked the Israeli defender and the Palestinian defender, what do you both think of your God validating slavery? The Israeli defender, well, we no longer have slaves or legalized slavery, but God must have had his reasons which we cannot question. The Palestinian defender, I agree. Allah cannot be questioned. The prosecution, I think many logical, moral people would be shocked and upset to learn that slavery was institutionalized by the God of the Bible and the Quran. They would reject the claim that God must have had some good reasons for validating slavery. Here are more quotes. In Exodus 12, it is written that God said to Moses, quote, "For the Passover, any slave who has been purchased may eat of it after he has been circumcised." In Exodus 21, it is written that God said to Moses, "These are the ordinances. When you buy a male Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years. If his master gives him a wife and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be her master's. When a man sells his daughter as a slave, if she does not please her master, when a slave owner strikes a male or female slave with a rod and the slave dies immediately, the owner shall be punished. But if the slave survives a day or two, there is no punishment, for the slave is the owner's property." Israeli and Palestinian defenders, are you not incensed by these rules set out by God regarding slavery? The Israeli defender, I do not question God. The Palestinian defender, I do not question Allah either. It is wrong to question Allah. The prosecutor, this blind faith you both have in God must appear objectionable to many logical, moral people today. Regarding slavery, even Jesus Christ validated it, hard as that seems. In Matthew 24, it is written that Jesus said to his disciples, "Blessed is the slave whom his master will find at work when he arrives. But in the case of a wicked slave who in his master's absence mistreats his fellow slaves and eats and drinks with drunkards, the master of that slave will return at home at a time when he is not expected and cut the wicked slave in pieces and put him with the hypocrites, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." Jesus famously condemned all hypocrites to hell, the place where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now, this quote from the Gospel of Matthew in the New Testament is very significant. Your Honor, please allow me a digression on this point because it has great historical importance for 2 reasons. Will you allow me? The judge, all right, but be brief. You keep testing my patience. The prosecution, the fact that Jesus affirms the validity of slavery, reinforcing God's laws on slavery passed on to Moses, explains why there was slavery in the United States for 70 years after the Declaration of Independence, which famously declared, quote, "All men are created equal, endowed with the unalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness," end quote. A seeming contradiction until one realizes that the American slave owners were all Christians, believers in the Bible's Old Testament and New Testament. Their reasoning must have been the following. If slavery is good for God, for Moses, and for Jesus Christ, then slavery is good for us. Who can deny that had Jesus declared that slavery was immoral, and prohibited it, there would have been no slavery in the United States or in any other Christian society. It must be noted for context that Jesus did take the time to object to divorce, which was institutionalized by God in the laws passed on to Moses. So Jesus was not in agreement with every one of the laws passed on to Moses. And that is why divorce has not been accepted as legal by the Catholic Church. Strangely, it has been accepted by the Anglican Church. As for Islam, not only is divorce accepted, validated, and regulated just like in Judaism, but so is polygamy, which was widespread in the Old Testament. King Solomon, son of David, who fought Goliath, had 700 wives and 300 concubines. The second observation is on the matter of hell, which was introduced by Jesus Christ, as hell did not exist in the Old Testament. It is a place for the eternal punishment and torture of human beings. That explains why many Christians have engaged in torture, finding it institutionalized and validated by Jesus. As for the severe criticisms of Guantanamo, they seem misplaced when one considers that waterboarding was not inflicted on Al-Qaeda prisoners for the purpose of punishment, but only for the purpose of extracting information which would help prevent future terrorist attacks. Whereas Jesus' hell is exclusively for the purpose of punishment, not for any other reason. And it is eternal punishment, eternal torture. While we're at it, it's worth mentioning that Jesus also introduced heaven to humanity, as it did not exist in the Old Testament, where people simply died and were buried, there being no afterlife. In Jesus' heaven, the pleasure is simply being in the presence of God. It is a spiritual, not physical pleasure. That contrasts with Mohammed's heaven, where the pleasure is physical, with streams of cool water, shade under leafy trees full of fruit, and for each male Muslim martyr who died fighting for Islam, over 60 virgins. That heaven of physical pleasures was probably needed to recruit Muslim soldiers willing to fight for Muhammad and Islam. As for Muhammad's hell, it is physical as well, just like Jesus' hell. As for Christianity and Islam being merciful, that's not the case for humans who do not believe in Jesus or Muhammad, or for those who have sinned and not properly repented. In Matthew 25, it is written that Jesus said to his disciples, quote, "When the Son of Man comes in his glory, he will sit on the throne and say to those at his right hand, 'Come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you.' Then he will say to those at his left hand, 'You that are accursed, depart from me into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. These will go into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life.'" End quote. In the Quran, Surah 22, 19-21, it is written, quote, "As to those who disbelieve, for them are cut out garments of fire. Boiling water shall be poured over their heads. With it shall be melted what is in their bellies and their skins as well. And for them are whips of iron." End quote. Israeli Defender, what comments do you have about there being no heaven or hell in the Old Testament? The Israeli Defender, that's precisely why Jews do not believe in Jesus Christ with his promise of afterlife. The Jews confronted Jesus, telling him he was contradicting the Old Testament, their holy book, and was therefore not credible. The Jews also rejected him because he prohibited divorce, whereas they wanted divorce to remain legal. Jews believe God only helps them on earth when they fight against their enemies, and that God is not offering them life after death. The prosecution. Palestinian Defender, have I correctly stated that Muhammad's heaven is physical, not spiritual, like Jesus' heaven? The Palestinian Defender, that's true. Since you mentioned Muslim martyrs, I'd like to specify that only martyrs go to heaven immediately upon death. As for non-martyrs, After they die, they wait in their tomb until Judgment Day, at which time Allah decides who goes to heaven and who goes to hell. That can be a long wait. The prosecution. A long wait indeed. Now, let's proceed to Leviticus 20 in the Old Testament, where God told Moses, "If a man lies with a man as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination and shall be put to death. If a man takes a wife and her mother also, that is a depravity, and they all three shall be burned to death. Any person who is a medium or wizard shall be stoned to death." Quote, end quote. Here we see the biblical origins of the institutionalization and validation of anti-homosexual laws, as well as of anti-witches laws and of anti-promiscuity laws involving spouses and parents. Now, in modern Israel, there are no anti-homosexual laws, while in most Islamic countries, the anti-homosexual laws are fierce. Israeli Defender. Why is it that today in Israel homosexuality is not prosecuted, even though it is prohibited in the Old Testament? The Israeli Defendant. In modern Israel, homosexuality is not illegal because attitudes have evolved, and consequently, there are exceptions to Moses' laws. The prosecution. So you admit that not all of God's rules need to be applied, that modern man has the right to discard any of God's rules which seem primitive and violate human rights, and that this is the case with homosexuality. The Israeli Defendant. Yes, there are exceptions due to changing mentalities, more modern mentalities. The prosecution. Palestinian Defender. Why is it that in Islamic countries there has been no evolution regarding the acceptability of homosexuality? The Palestinian Defender. Because there has been no change in attitudes regarding homosexuality, which remains considered immoral and against nature. Furthermore, the Quran must be rigorously followed. There is no room for Allah's rules to be modified by humans. The prosecution. So, Islamic nations cannot modernize in any way which contradicts the Quran. Their rules and morality are frozen in time. Modernization is not possible when it goes against the Quran. The Palestinian Defender. That is correct. Allah's rules are absolute and timeless. In the Quran, not even one word or one comma can be changed. The prosecution. Has it ever occurred to Muslims that anti-homosexual sentiments and regulations are the result of deep-seated primordial fears that homosexuality threatened the survival of the human species by limiting births at a time when there were few humans on Earth and the risk of extinction was high, for example, due to famine? That anti-homosexual sentiments are instinctual in our DNA from the earliest days of humanity, but that those fears are completely misplaced today when there is no threat of extinction of the human species due to insufficient births. In fact, we have overpopulation today. In modern societies, for most people, logic has overcome deep-seated primordial instincts against homosexuality. Only religious people remain unthinkingly attached to the Bible's condemnation of homosexuality. Actually, many non-religious people, dominated by primitive instincts, are also against homosexuality. They are generally not well educated. Now, in the Old Testament's Deuteronomy 22, it is written that Moses told the Israelites, quote, "If the charge is true that the young woman's virginity was not found after she was given in marriage, then the elders shall bring the young woman out to the entrance of her father's house, and the men of her town shall stone her to death, because she committed a disgraceful act by prostituting herself. So shall you purge the evil from your midst." End quote. Here we have the institutionalization and validation of the idea that only women must be virgins until they marry, not also men. This is clearly a human rights violation, a discrimination on the basis of gender. Gender discrimination against women started in primitive patriarchal societies, but has lasted for millennia, and even to this day, women's equal rights are violated whether by law or in practice in many retrograde nations, particularly those dominated by religion. Even in the most advanced nations, women's equal rights are often violated in practice, though against the law, as many men have a bias against women's equal rights. Those are mostly men with inferiority complexes. Those men are also typically racist and feel threatened by minorities becoming more educated than them and more economically successful than them. Well-educated men are not racist. They do not feel threatened by minorities and do not feel threatened by strong, educated, successful women. Now, Palestinian defender, what do you think of Islamic society's requirement of women being covered, some to the point of being completely covered by burqas, of women not having the right to ask for divorce, of requiring women to obtain their father's or brother's or husband's permission to travel, of women not being allowed to drive a car, especially when not accompanied by a male family member? The Palestinian defender. The Quran, Allah's word, is more important than any laws made by humans. Humans cannot be on the same level as Allah or higher. In fact, human laws, which go against Allah's commands, are null and void. They are blasphemous. So this is the end of part 2 of the play, The Israeli-Palestinian Conflict on Trial. And we will pick up on part 3, which will be coming up. Thanks for your attention.